We are on DAF Lamed. Let's go, Rabbi. A lot of ground to cover. We were learning yesterday about a get that has a delayed mechanism to it. So, like, for example, a person says, I only want the get to take effect in 12 months from now, retroactively. In other words, if I don't come home in 12 months, then I want the get to work retroactively from now. The Gemara had said that that works under certain conditions, that you obviate the possibility of it being a get yashan and so forth. But related to that is the following case. Hahu da Omar, we're the third line of Daf Lamed. Hahu da Omar, ilo asina atlasin yomin lihavi gita. A man tells his wife, if I don't come home within the next 30 days, then the get is a get. So, asa upaske mabora. What happened was the guy came back on day 30, but the bridge was out to cross the river, and he's standing on the other side of the river. Amar lahu chazu de'asai, chazu de'asai. He says, I'm here, I'm here. So Amar Shmuel lo shmei masya. Shmuel says, sorry Charlie, you're out of luck. Your wife is divorced. Now, as we're going to see in a moment, there's a machlokes as to whether a person has a good taina of oines. He says, yes, it's true that I made this tanai, but I had a mishap that I wasn't able to negate the tanai because of a mishap. Is that a valid taina or not? So if you say that that's not a valid taina, that would explain why Shmuel said, I'm sorry, you're still divorced. But according to the opinion that you do have a good taina if there was a mishap, Shmuel's response would be, but this is a mishap that you should have anticipated, because it is quite common for the bridge to be out, for the river to swell and not be able to cross it. So what you should have said is, if I don't come back in 30 days, barring any impediments because of weather or because of logistics or an act of God, then you're divorced. But the fact that he didn't say that means that he meant it to be unconditional, and that's why the divorce is divorce. Hahu da Amar lahu, ilo paisanala atlasin yomin lihavi gita, azul paisa velo ifaisa. The following story. This, of course, we could certainly imagine this happening. A guy gets into real hot water with his wife. He's in the doghouse, and the problem is that his wife says, I want a divorce, and he's desperate. He wants to try and keep this marriage together. So he says as follows. He says, okay, I'll give you a get, provided, but it's only going to work if I cannot appease you in 30 days. If in 30 days I cannot appease you and reconcile with you, so then, I'm going to give it my best shot, and if I can't, then you'll be divorced. So he does everything. He stands on his head, buys her stuff, whatever it is, does the dishes, takes out the garbage, does everything he's supposed to do. Nothing works, and after 30 days, she still wants a divorce. So Amar Rav Yosef mi yoyev la tarkava dedinri velo ifaisa. So Rav Yosef says she's divorced. You know why she's divorced? Because the guy could have always done more. Did he buy her a treasure chest of gold? Did he give her a chest full of gold coins? No, he didn't. Maybe if he would have gone the extra mile, she would have been appeased. In other words, his tanai, he can't claim that I was an oines, because his tanai was, I will do whatever it takes to appease you. And Rav Yosef said, well, you didn't do everything it takes, because even if you don't have the money, there's always more that you could have done. And that's why Rav Yosef says, sorry, you're divorced. Ika da Amri, Amr Rav Yosef, midi tarkava de dinri boy lamesavla. Some say that, no, Rav Yosef said just the opposite. He was saying, what, you expect him to give her a treasure chest of gold? In other words, the guy's done everything that he was ha-paisa velo ifaisa. He did whatever he possibly could, and therefore he fulfilled his end of the deal, and therefore the get is not a good get. The get was only being a good get if he wouldn't have put in his full effort, but he put in the full effort. So therefore the get is not a good get, even if the woman is not appeased. And so hakaman da'amar yesh ones begitten, hakaman da'amar ein ones begitten. Now when we analyze these two versions of what Rav Yosef actually said, it becomes clear that the first version holds that, sorry, you can't claim, I was an oines, I tried my best and I had a mishap. Sorry, if you made that stipulation that the get will be active if you can't appease her, and you were unsuccessful, so deal's off. You're going to claim oines, I really thought I could do it. Too bad. That's not a valid claim. The latter version of Rav Yosef says, no, if you gave it all your effort and you really thought that this was going to work, and because of some unforeseen circumstance, like your wife still leaves you in the doghouse, and that's the only reason. So there, Rav Yosef is more sympathetic, and he says, "Listen, you did everything you were supposed to do. You had every intention of getting your wife to forgive you, and if she didn't, it's like a case of onus that you didn't anticipate, and therefore you're not divorced." Let's go on to the next Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah is continuing along the theme of chazaka, where you can rely on a chazaka in order to establish halachic fact. Okay, this is really the theme of all of the Shmais. This now doesn't have anything to do with Gittin. It's just really more of a chazaka issue. Hamal v'mos es hakoin ves halevi ves ha'ani lios mafrish alehen mechelkan mafrish alehen becheskas shehin kayamin ve'eno choshe shamames hakohen o halevi o ha'eshir ha'ani. Okay, so the Mishnah now tells us the following halacha. A man lends $100 to a Kohen or a Levi or to an Ani, a poor man. And he says, "You know what, my friend, I have a farm, and I have to tithe at the end of the season. And the grain that I have is going to yield worth more than $100. I have to give Meiser anyway. So you know what? Instead of you paying me back cash, I'll just segregate $100 worth of grain that I would normally give to you as the Levi, or $100 worth of grain of Truma that I would normally give to the Kohen, and I'll keep that for myself." And that's the deal that they make. Now, the question is, does the farmer have to check and make sure that the Kohen or the Levi is still alive by the end of the season? No. There's a chazaka that the Kohen or the Levi is still alive. And this works by an ani as well, because there is something called every third and sixth year of the Shemitah cycle, the second tithe is not Meiser Sheni, but rather Meiser Ani, that you give a tithe to the poor. So you can say also, my friend, the Ani, what I'll do is I'll hold back $100 worth of grain from Meiser Ani, and I'll keep it for myself instead of making you pay me back the $100. You don't have to worry that maybe in the meantime the guy won the lottery, and therefore he's not entitled to Meiser Ani, in which case you wouldn't be able to take. You couldn't say that this is his Meiser Ani, because maybe he's not entitled to it anymore. So that's another consideration when you're dealing with a poor person. His status may have changed from being poor to being rich, and that we're not worried about either.
So he's selling the truma to the Kohen, basically. He lent the money to the Kohen, or Levi, and said...
No, he's buying the truma from the Kohen. You see, he's buying the truma from the Kohen. The truma belongs to the Kohen. He's saying, I'm going to keep it instead...
So who's the person...
The farmer. The farmer is a Yisrael.
I see. The
farmer is a Yisrael. He's already lent the money. He's lent $100 to the Kohen. He says, "You know what? Instead of you paying me cash, I'll set aside truma, I'll designate it for you, and I'll keep it, and I'll sell it to another Kohen, and I'll make money off of it." Right? So that way it'll be easier for you, it'll be easier for me. Now understand this. The rabbis are happy with this guy. They like this farmer. Because what this farmer is doing is that he's willing to do chesed and lend money to people in need. So keep that in mind. Because he's a good guy, we want to accommodate him as much as possible. You see, normally we might not be willing to accommodate him, because if a guy segregates truma, normally there'd have to be actual kinyan to give it to the Kohen. But the rabbis are going to say, you know what, it's okay. Just segregate it, declare it to be truma, declare it to be the truma of that Kohen, and then you barter it with the debt that the Kohen owes you, and you can keep it.
You're going to be a while? Sorry.
Unfortunately, I had to give the DAF, so I'll be here until 9 o'clock.
No,
and
I just wanted to... Okay, I'll say a few words.
And then I'm going to come in at 9, okay? I'm sorry. Mazel tov, Mike.
Okay. So isn't it Kaddish? How can he eat it?
Yes, it is Kaddish. We're not saying he's going to eat it. He's going to sell it to another Kohen.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Can he sell truma to a Kohen?
You can, if the truma is financially your property, then you can sell it. You can only sell it to a Kohen, though, because only a Kohen can consume it. Right? But you can sell it. Okay? All right. Next. Okay, guys? Everything good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Makes business and pleasure.
Good.
Okay, next. Mesu tzarech litol rishus min hayorshin. Now, what about if you hear that the Kohen or the Levi has passed? In that situation, when you tithe truma, you can't say that this belongs to the Kohen. He's dead. You can't give... There's no truma for dead Kohanim. Right? So what are you supposed to do? The Yorshim are not obligated to assume the debt, this kind of debt of their father, because the debt has already been settled. In other words, it's not like there's a lien out, there's paper out, and so forth. This was a very casual form of debt, and so you can't impose this debt upon the Yorshim. But what you can do, if the Yorshim want to go the extra mile and do lifnim mishuras hadin, and really fulfill what they feel morally is their father's debt, you can go over to the Yorshim and say, are you children of the Kohen, who are yourselves Kohanim, are you maskim, do you agree that I'll set aside the truma, I'll designate it for you, and then you'll use that as payment of your father's debt? If they agree, then that also works. But you have to get permission from the Yorshim. Now, that's only when the loan was made outside of Beis Din. However, im hilvan bifnei Beis Din, eino tzarech litol rishus min haYorshim. Then you don't even have to ask the heirs. Because remember, I told you this guy's a good guy, this farmer. We like him, the rabbi said. We like him. He's lending money to people. We want to incentivize him to always lend more money to people. So we don't want him to figure that he got stiffed now because of the stiff, so he's not going to lend out any more money. But rather we say, you know what? As long as you made the loan in front of Beis Din to the Kohen, then if he dies, we, the Beis Din, will declare the debt to be resumed by his children, and therefore you can set aside truma for the children and then keep it for yourself as payment for the debt. Because Beis Din has the power to do that. Hefker, Beis Din, Hefker. They can reassign financial finances to different parties, whatever they see it's appropriate, in order to re-incentivize farmers to lend money out.
If in either case the children, it was done outside of Beis Din and the children don't want to do that, or the Beis Din doesn't get involved, what are the logistics?
The farmer's out of luck. The farmer's out of luck. He's got to eat the debt.
He can't sell that truma to.
No, he's got to give the truma to some other Kohen.
He has to give it away.
He has to give it away. That's the obligation of truma. Truma is always you tithe it and you give it to the Kohen. The only time that you can sell it is if the Kohen gives it back to you. The Kohen, if you're a Kohen, I give you my truma, right?
That's the other way you are going.
Okay, but if I give you truma and you give it back to me as a gift, then it's mine. I can do with it whatever I want. But I have to give it to you. The Torah obligates me to give this truma to you as a tithe.
You can't eat it if I give it back.
I can't eat it, but I can sell it to another Kohen. It becomes now, it becomes chattel. It becomes my property. Okay. Let's take a look now at the Gemara. So, frek the Gemara v'afal gav deloasu liyadeh? Question mark. So the Gemara says, what mechanism is working here that we are so flippant to allow this? I mean, think about it for a second. The farmer has tithed the truma or the meiser, and there's been no physical exchange. There's been no kinyan that the Kohen debtor or the Levi debtor is made. So how does this work that it acts as the payment of the loan? And not only that, but how can you say that this truma is designated for that particular Kohen? I mean, the truma, it belongs to all Kohanim, technically, until you give it to a specific Kohen or Levi. So the Gemara's answer is, Omar Rav b'makore kahuna ulavia. So Rav says, we're talking about a case where the farmer has established a pattern for years that he always gives his truma or meiser to that Kohen or that Levi. And because of that, all other Kohanim and Leviim are considered to have absented themselves, relinquished their rights or their dibs on that truma and meiser, and therefore that's why the mechanism works automatically, that as soon as he declares this to be truma or meiser, it belongs to that particular Kohen debtor, and therefore the farmer can take it back as the payment of the debt. Ushmuel Amar b'mizakelem al yedei achem. Shmuel has a different answer. Shmuel says what the farmer needs to do actually is he needs to pull a friend over and say, acquire this on behalf of the Kohen or Levi debtor. And without doing that, it's not going to work. And Ula says, I have a third explanation about our Mishnah. And he says, Hamani Rabbi Yossi, da Amar asu es she'eno zocha kezocha. That Rabbi Yossi is very liberal when it comes to the Beis Din's powers. And he says, Beis Din, in many instances, can actually create a legal transfer when the legal transfer would not normally happen. They can declare, even when in the absence of a kinyan, that the property automatically belongs to person A. right? And that's what's going on over here. Even though normally, under normal circumstances, this does not work because there's no mechanism and there's been no designated Kohen here. But nevertheless, the rabbis, in order to incentivize people to make loans, will say that the farmer can say that this is for Kohen the debtor and it belongs to Kohen the debtor.
Why can't we just say Zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav?
But you need someone to take it from the one party to the other party, right? So if I want to be mizakeh to you, Harold, and you're not here, I can't just pick it up myself if it belongs to me. I have to give it to a third party. I got to give it to Danny first, and Danny can be zocheh for you. Okay, but that's exactly what Shmuel says. Now the Gemara now says we have three opinions. The question is why does each rabbi hold his position and not assent to the other positions? Kulu kirav lo amri b'makari lo kitani. Now the other rabbis disagree with Rav, who says that we're dealing with a Kohen that you've established a pattern of giving to, is because that's not what it says in the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't qualify it that way. Kishmuel lo kamri b'mezaka lo kitani. And the other two rabbis don't hold of Shmuel that we're talking about a third party picking it up on behalf of the Kohen, because again, the Mishnah doesn't state that that's what happens. And the reason the other two rabbis, Rav and Shmuel, don't say like Ula, that it's going like Rabbi Yossi, is because there's an aversion to saying that a Mishnah goes like a Das Yachid, like an individual opinion that has dissenting majority. Tana Rabbanan. Hamal v'Moses hakohen v'Alevi v'Sa'ani lios mafresh alein mechelkan mafresh len b'cheska shehin kayamin. So the first part of the Bryce is a repeat verbiage of our Mishnah. If I lend $100 to the Kohen or the Levi or to the Ani, I can simply at the end of the season set aside the tithe for them and use that as repayment of the debt. However, uposek imahin kisha'ar hazol ve'ein bo mishum ribis. But what I am allowed to do, and this is a further leniency that's itemized in the Brisa, is that let's say the price of wheat has not yet been established at the time when I make the loan. What I can do is I can say, whatever the price of wheat is at the time of the harvest will establish how much $100 worth of wheat is. So let's say, for example, right now, because it's out of season, a bushel of wheat costs $100. But by the time the debt is matured and it's the end of the season, a bushel of wheat is only $50. So therefore, really, I've lent him a bushel worth of cash, and now I'm taking back as my payment 2 bushels of wheat. So the Brisa says that's not a problem of ribis, because at the time of the maturity of the debt, I'm really taking back $100 worth of wheat. Even though it's twice as much as what $100 could have purchased back then, it's not a problem of ribis. And then the Brisa says, Ve'ein shvius misham taso, that Shemitah will not wipe out this debt. So if in the interim, the end of Shemitah came, don't think that the Lova can say, that the debtor can say, I'm sorry, I don't owe you anything and you can't do this anymore. The next thing the Brisa says, which is ambiguous, if one of the parties wants to retract on the deal, he does not have the right to do so. We'll clarify that in a minute. And then it says, Nisyashu haba'olim ein mafrish aleihem lefi she'ein mafrishan al ha'avad. And then the Brisa says that in the event that the farmer gives up on the crop, so then the halacha is that he cannot use this tithing process to pay back as payment of the debt. Now, what do we mean? Let's say the farmer planted the crops, and then there was a blight in the crops. The crops became diseased, and the farmer says, and we hear him say this, he says, "Oi, I'm never going to grow anything from these crops." Well, the fact is that since the farmer had designated these crops as the payment, as the repayment of the loan, he can no longer, once he's given up and said, I'm never getting any crops from here, he's basically said, I'm forgiving the loan. So if perchance, after he gave up on the crops miraculously were revived and the blight was cured, and by the end of the season there were crops, he can no longer take the tithe of the crops as his payment, because he's already technically forgiven the debt. So that's another thing. Now, Omar Mar, let's go back and analyze each halacha of this brisa now. Posek imoim kishar hazol pshita. So, what do you mean that the brisa tells me that in this case you're allowed to use the price of wheat at the time of the maturity of the loan? Isn't that obvious? That's true with all debts. Like, what's the chiddush of this brisa? Hakamashmalan afal pishalo pasak kemisha pasak dami that ve'ein bo mishum ribis. The answer is that the chiddush is that even though at the time that the loan was made, there was no fixed price on wheat, and the guy says, since there's no fixed price on wheat currently because it's out of season, what we're going to do is we're going to use an estimate of what wheat will be worth at the time of the maturity of the loan. We estimate that it'll be worth $100 per, or let's say only $50 per bushel, and therefore I'm going to take 2 bushels as payment of my loan. He says that's perfectly legal, even though the price has not been published yet, the price has not come out yet, and there's no problem of ribis, there's no problem of even an appearance of taking more than what you're entitled to, even though you're projecting based upon what you anticipate. Because basically what we're saying is that the farmer can stipulate whatever is within the realm of likelihood. He's allowed to stipulate at the time when he makes the loan. And why is that legal? Even if at the time, let's say, of the maturity of the loan, he's a little bit off and he's taking more wheat. My time, the answer is, says the Gemara, is that since this is speculative and the farmer could actually end up with no crops at all, it's not a problem of ribis, because ribis is only when you're guaranteed a return. But here there's no guarantee of return at all, and therefore it's not a problem of taking more than you lent out. And next, we'll learn more about these laws of ribis when we get into Bava Metzia. And then the Brisa had said, Ve'en shvius misham taso. The reason why this debt cannot be canceled through Shemitah is the lo karina be lo yigos. Because the Torah says that the only type of debts that are canceled at the end of Shemitah are debts where I can go to the debtor and say, give me the money that's in your pocket. But here, the farmer can't go to the Kohen of the Levi because he's already established that whatever you owe me is already in my possession. So that's a kind of debt that does not get canceled by Shemitah. Next, the imbal lachzer eno chozer, that if one of the parties wants to go back on the deal, he doesn't have the option. So Rav Papa qualifies this. Amar Rav Papa lo shanu ela bal habayis bekohen, aval kohen bebal habayis imbal lachzer chozer. Rav Papa says this means that the farmer cannot go back on the deal and say, I've changed my mind, I want you to pay me back the debt in cash. That's what it means. But technically, the Kohen can go back on the deal if he wants to. The Kohen can say, I've changed my mind, I'd rather pay you $100 cash instead of waiting for you to take payment of the loan with the grain at the end of season. Now, why is the Kohen allowed to do that? Because technically, as long as the Balabayas has not made a legal kinyan of that grain from the Kohen to the farmer, there's been no legal exchange, everyone can go back on the deal. And that's true with any law of buying and selling. If I sell you a bushel of grain and you pay me the $100, but you haven't yet made a kinyan on the bushel of grain, you're not the legal owner, and therefore either party can go back on the deal. So therefore, if the Kohen wants to, he can say, listen, you haven't yet made a kinyan technically on my grain yet that you want to set aside and give to me, so therefore I've made a decision that I'd rather pay you with cash instead of you taking possession of the grain, and I'll take the grain. Okay, let us go weiter. Nisyashu haba'olim ein mafrish aleihim lefisha ein mafrishin al ha'avod. The next thing that we said in the Brisa is that if the owner had given up hope of ever getting any grain from this season, so then he cannot later reclaim it if by some fluke the grain actually is produced. So pshita, isn't that obvious? He's already forgiven the loan. So the Gemara says, lo tzricha da'akun. No, we're talking about a case where the blight came relatively late in the season. In other words, what happened was he planted wheat seeds and they grew as stalks, so it's a little bit late in the season, and then the blight occurred. So there's mold all over the stalks, and the farmer says, this is terrible, we're not going to get any wheat this year. That's already a forgiveness of the debt. But mahu detema akanta milsahi kamash malan. But you might have thought that maybe he's not really fully miyash, really he's not fully giving up hope, since he sees the stalks in front of him. And therefore, even if there's that glimmer of hope that maybe the blight will be cured, that's not considered a full forgiveness of the debt, Kamash Malan, that's what the Brisa tells me, is that no, once he said, I forget it, it's not going to happen, that means he's forgiven the debt and he can no longer claim it if a fluke occurs and he's able to get some yield. Tanya, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, Hamal v'moses hakoin v'salevi beveistin umesu, mafresh alein b'cheskas oso hashevet v'sani beveistin, so the Brisa says that according to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, if you lend money to a Kohen or a Levi in the presence of a Beis Din, and the Kohen and the Levi dies, so then when you tithe the Truma or the Meiser, you can hold it back even though the Kohen is no longer alive, and Beis Din basically awards you all of the Kohanim in the world are basically represented by the Beis Din, and the Beis Din says you can keep that truma. In other words, we are forgiving the dibs that any Kohen may have on that truma, and you get to keep it. And as I mentioned to you before, Beis Din makes that accommodation for a nice guy. He's a nice guy, he wants to lend people money, and we want to re-incentivize him to make future loans, and so therefore Beis Din will use their powers of Hefker, Beis Din, Hefker to basically say that we speak on behalf of all Kohanim and all of Leviim that the Truma, the Meiser, is yours. And if he lends money to an Ani in the presence of Beis Din, and then the Ani dies, so basically he can do the same thing. The Beis Din says, on behalf of all Aniyim in Klal Yisrael, we hereby allow you to take that for yourself as repayment of the debt. But Rabbi Achi Omer becheskas aniyei olam, he changes the language and he says it's not on behalf of all of the aniyim in Yisrael, but rather it's on behalf of all of the aniyim in the world that Beis Din is acting. So my benai, what's the difference between these two languages? Answers the Gemara, Ike beinaihu aniyei kusiyim. The difference is, we're talking about a case where in this particular town where this farmer lives, that guy that was the ani was the only Jewish ani. And the only other ani that's in the town is a kusi. A kusi is a dispute at different points in history. What is his status? Does he have a status of a Yisrael, a Jew, or does he have a status of a Goy? So if you learn like the first opinion, that it's on behalf of Aniyei Yisrael, that language implies that on behalf of that kusi that you would normally give the tithe to, we forgive it on his behalf to you, and you can keep it on his behalf. But if you learn like the second version, that it's aniyei olam, that opinion holds, Rabbi Achi holds that kusi is a goy, and therefore we're doing it on behalf of the aniyim outside your town, aniyei olam that are Jewish. Okay, fine. Now, ha'ashir ha'ani ein mafresh alav, v'zacha halav b'masha biyado. But then the Brisa says something a little bit startling. It says, even though this guy has made the loan in Beis Din to this ani, if, however, the ani doesn't die, but rather the ani wins the lottery and becomes wealthy, so then, sorry, the farmer, you're out of luck. You have to give the ani tithe. You can't give it to that guy because he's an Ashir now, and instead you have to give it to some other ani who did not owe you money, and therefore you're out of your loan. The debt is forgiven, and there's nothing more to talk about. So the Rabbanan Maishna Lamisa da Vitakanta, Umaishna La Ashiris Aloa Vitakanta. So the question is, why is it that the Chachamim made a special accommodation that we give you, that on behalf of all aniyim in the world, we let you, the farmer, keep the grain that you would normally have to give to the poor? We do that in a case where the ani that you lent the money to died. Whereas in this case, where the money that you lent to the ani didn't die, but rather he became wealthy, why don't we make that same accommodation and say that, no, on behalf of all aniyim, you get to keep the tithe? Why don't we say that? So the Gemara answers, Misa shchicha ashiras lo shchicha. In a bit of a sad reflection on society in the times of the Gemara says, because death is common, becoming wealthy is not common. In other words, something that is common, the Chachamim will make an accommodation for. And therefore they'll say, if the ani died, we'll accommodate you, the farmer, because you're such a nice guy, and we'll let you keep the ani tithe. But in a situation where the ani becomes wealthy, that's such a fluke that the Chachamim don't step in that case and make special takanas in very uncommon cases. Amar of Papa, Hainu da Amri Inshi, Chavrach Mis Asher, is Asher Losa Asher. That's why there's a common saying that if someone tells you that your friend is dead, you can believe him. But if they tell you that your friend has become wealthy, don't believe him. That's a pretty sad reflection. Baruch Hashem, we live in different times. But there's a certain sadness when you read this Gemara. Then we had said in the Mishnah that if you lent money outside of Beis Din to the Kohen, the Levi, or the Ani, and then the Kohen or the Levi dies, so the halacha is you have to get permission from the family to say, would you like to resume your father's debt? And if they say yes, then you can set aside the truma or the meiser on behalf of the children, and then keep it for yourself as payment of the debt. So Tanya, Rebbe Omer, Yarshin Sheyarshu. So the Brisa quotes Rebbe as saying something bizarre. He says this only applies to heirs who inherit. So the Gemara says, Umika Yarshin Delo Yarsi. What does that mean? How can you ever have an heir who doesn't inherit? That doesn't make sense. So Ela Amar Rabbi Yochanan Sheyarshu Karka Velo Sheyarshu Kasafim. Rabbi Yochanan says it means as follows. The only time that you have even a moral right to go over to an heir in this case is if the heirs inherited real estate from the father. Because they inherited real estate from the father, that's why it's called real estate. It's a real asset that you can point to and say, this belonged to your father, and morally you have a moral obligation to pay back his debts. But if the father just left chattel, then even a moral obligation there isn't to pay back the debt of the father, because after all, there was never a lien placed on any of his property to begin with, and therefore there's no obligation at all, and therefore the farmer has no right to go to the children and ask them to assume the father's debt. So Amar Rabbi Yonasan, hiniach malo machat gova malo machat, malo kardom gova malo kardom. But Rabbi Yonasan says on that basis it depends how much real estate the father left over when he died. If the debt was for $100 and the father only left over $50 of real estate, then the farmer can only collect $50 worth of grain as repayment, and the other $50 he'll have to swallow. However, but if it's a larger piece, he'll get the whole thing. But Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan says that even if the father left over even a small, tiny piece of property that's worth only a fraction of the debt, you can look at that karka as being, you can tap into that multiple times until the debt is paid off. So basically, what the farmer will do is that he'll say, okay, your father left you a $25 piece of real estate. You guys owe me $100, so I'll take $25 worth of grain as the ani tithe, as the Kohen tithe on behalf of the debt, and that'll put that in my pocket. Then I'll take another $25 worth of truma grain and go back to the karka and attach that, so to speak, in a conceptual sense to the karka, and put that in my pocket. And you'll do that 4 times until the debt is paid off. And the Gemara says that works in certain circumstances, which we'll see more clearly when there was a case in Ksuvis that had addressed that situation, that in a case of a real debt where there was a lien on a property and the property went to the Yorshim, the property was only worth 50 and the creditor's debt was for 100. So the Yorshim, the creditor came and said, I'm going to take the property. The children said, no, we'll pay you the 50, just let us keep the property. He took the $50, and then he came back to them again and said, okay, you paid back half the loan, now I'm going to take the property again. And they had to pay him another $50 to pay off the debt. Tana Rabbanan, Yisrael Shamar Levi, Meiser Yeshli Biyadcha, Ein Choshishin L'Trumas Meiser Shabo. But Kor Meiser Yeshli Biyadcha, Choshin L'Trumas Meiser Shabo. This is a brisa that at face value it's very difficult to understand what it means. A Jewish farmer goes over to a Levi and he says, I have Meiser that in my possession that belongs to you, I need to give it to you. And so the Levi says, thank you very much. The brisa says you don't have to worry that there's any trumas meiser, which is the tithe that the Levi has to take. When a Levi gets meiser, he has to take 10% of that and give it to the Kohen, and it has a din of truma. So you don't have to worry that there's any trumas meiser commingled with that meiser. If, however, the farmer says to him, I have a specific amount, let's say I have a korb, let's say call that a bushel. I have a bushel of meiser that I have to give you, then you have to worry that there is trumas meiser commingled into that grain. Now the Gemara says, "My Comer, what does this all mean? Like what are you talking about?" So Amar Abaye Hachi Kamar, let's clarify. Yisrael Shamar Lelevi, Meiser Yesh Lecha Biyadi, Vehelach Damav, Ein Choshishin Shema Aso Trumas Meiser Al Makom Acher. It works, but Kor Meiser Yesh Lecha Biyadi, Vehelach Damav, Choshishin Shema Aso Trumas Meiser Al Makom Acher. So Abaye says the following explanation. You see, a Levi, technically, a Levi can amass Meiser from many different sources. And then once he's amassed, let's say he's got 20 bushels of Meiser that he's amassed from multiple different farmers who have given him their Meiser, he then takes 10% of that, 2 bushels, and gives that to the Kohen. What if the Levi has already amassed 18 bushels of wheat, and then this Yisrael goes over to him and says, you know what, I have also Meiser that I've set aside for you and I need to give you. So if the Levi had said, I have 2 bushels of Meiser that I have to give you, then you have to worry that maybe the Levi will be conniving, and because what is the farmer proposing? Instead of me giving you this Meiser, do me a favor, let me just give you cash, and I'll keep the grain. It'll be easier for you, it'll be easier for me. The Levi says, okay. He takes the money from the farmer, puts it in his pocket, and then the Levi might go ahead and say, wait a minute, now that I've got 20 bushels of grain, even though the farmer paid me for those 2 bushels, but I got a great idea. Why don't I just declare those 2 bushels that the farmer has in his possession that were earmarked for me, I'll declare those to be my Trumas Meiser. And that way I'll get to keep all 18 bushels that are now in my possession, plus I'll get the cash. It's a pretty sneaky thing to do. It's an evil thing to do, but you have to be choshesh, says Abaye, that maybe the Levi will do it. He's an unscrupulous individual and maybe he'll do it. But if the Yisrael farmer goes over to the Levi and says, I have Meiser that I need to give you, then you don't have to worry that the Levi is going to do this shtick, because the Levi has no idea how much grain the guy's talking about. So there's no way that he can possibly designate the grain as Trumas Meiser, because Trumas Meiser has to be 10%. And if he doesn't know how much, then you don't have to worry that if you want to make a deal with the Levi and buy the Meiser from him, the Levi's going to end up messing you up. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Atu b'rishi askinan deshakli demeu mashvilu Trumas Meiser? Abaye, how can you say that? Is the Brisa addressing a case where the Levi is living as a frum Jew? He wants to, he's got the halachic concerns of Meiser, Trumas Meiser, and then he's going to end up being a ganef? In other words, he's going to take the Levi's money and then go ahead and have the chutzpah to declare it to be Trumas Meiser, because he can say, well, technically I never made a kinyan, so it's really still mine, even though I took the money, and and I'll make it Trumas Meiser. What, you were talking about a Russia? You think that's really what we have to worry about? So Ella Amar of Misharshia Berider of Idi Hachika Amar. So really, that's not the pshat. What the Brisa means to talk about is the following case: Yisrael Shomer Leben Levi Meiser leAvicha biyadi Heilach Damav Ein Choshishin Shema Aso Aviv Trumas Meiser Makom Acher. But Kor Meiser leAvicha biyadi VeHeilach Damav Choshishin Shema Aso Aviv Trumas Meiser Makom Acher. The case is where the farmer had set aside Meiser for this Levi's father, and it was before there was no deal where the father took money for the Meiser. He had previously disclosed to this Levi's father, I have Meiser for you, and I'm going to be giving it to you. So there, if the farmer had disclosed how many bushels of Meiser he has, you have to be choshesh that maybe the deceased Levi had designated that as Trumas Meiser, and therefore the farmer, if he wants to sort of hold it for himself, he's not going to be able to. He's going to have to leave it for a Kohen. But if the farmer had never disclosed to the father how much grain, he just said, I have Meiser that I have to give you, so then you don't have to worry that the deceased Levi had designated it as Trumas Meiser. That's what the Brisa means. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, but that's also problematic, says the Gemara. You know why? Because there's a halacha that whenever you tithe truma, whether it's regular truma or trumas meiser, if you're a Levi, the truma has to be lechatchila. It has to be physically adjacent to the rest of the grain that you're tithing from. So you're going to tell me that a Levi who is scrupulous in mitzvahs is going to designate grain that's not in his possession currently, and is going to designate it as Trumas Meiser. Now, if he does it, b'di'evid, it works. But why should we be choshed that a Levi is going to go ahead lechatchila and do something that's keneged the halacha and designate something that's not spatially present and designate that as Trumas Meiser? So that doesn't make any sense either, says the Gemara. So rather what? So Ella, so Amar Ravashi Hachika Amar. So rather, the Gemara says, you're right. Ravashi says, this is the correct interpretation of the Brisa. Ben Yisrael Shamar Levi, Kach Amar Li Abba. Meiser lecha biyadi o meiser leavicha biyadi choshishim letrumas meiser shabo kaven delo kitz lo hava mesakin le balabayas. But kor meiser lecha biyadi o kor meiser leavicha biyadi ein choshishim letrumas meiser shabo kaven de kitz tekune takne balhabayas. So the Gemara says like this. This is what's going on. We're talking about the following case. The son of the farmer was deceased. The farmer told his son before he died, son, I have meiser that belongs to my friend the Levi. And so the son, after his father passes away, knows that this grain that has been set aside by his father as meiser belongs to the Levi. And he wants to give it to the Levi. So the question is like this. Did the father, before he died, did the father take Trumas Meiser or not? Now, is it the farmer's obligation to take Trumas Meiser, or is it the Levi's obligation to take Trumas Meiser? It's the Levi's obligation. It's not the farmer's obligation. But if a person knows that he's dying, like Lahavdil David Bowie, Alav Shalom, he knew that he was dying, so he wanted to put all his house in order. He put out a new album right before he died. It's a chashuv thing, right? You want to make sure that everything is in place before you pass away, right? So this farmer, if he knows that he's dying, he's not going to leave meiser in his possession that has to still have Trumas Meiser taken from it. Even though it's not his obligation, no Fruma Yid is going to want to have meiser that has Trumas Meiser mixed in with it before he dies, because he knows that could potentially be damaging. So it all depends. If the farmer told his son before he died, I know exactly how much meiser I have, I've set aside exactly 1 bushel of grain for this meiser, so then you know that for sure he must have tithed it as well from the Trumas Meiser before he died. But if the farmer didn't know how much grain was meiser, because he had just approximated it and didn't know exactly where it was and how much it was segregated, or how much of that segregated grain, how much the volume was, so then you have to worry that perhaps he didn't take Trumas Meiser because you have to take 10%. And since he hadn't carefully measured it yet, you can't really be assured that he's taken Trumas Meiser because it wasn't measured and he didn't tell you exactly how much it is. So the Gemara now says, V'chi yesh lo rishus lebalabais litrum Trumas Meiser, and with this we'll finish. Since when does a farmer have even a right to take Trumas Meiser? Is that not the Levi's purview? Where does the balabais, the farmer, get the right to do that? So the Gemara says, in Abelazar ben Gamlahi, because this goes according to Abelazar ben Gamlo. The Tanya, Abelazar ben Gamlo oimer, v'nechshav lachem trumaschem, b'shtei trumas hakasav medaber, echas truma Gedalia, echas trumas meiser. There's a pasuk that talks about Trumas Meiser, but it uses the word Truma in the plural to teach you that the laws of Truma Gedalia, of regular Truma, are exactly equivalent to the laws of Trumas Meiser. And it teaches you the following. Kishem shetruma Gedalia niteles ba'omer v'machshava, kach Trumas Meiser niteles ba'omer v'machshava. That just like regular Truma, you can approximate it and you can eyeball it in order to designate what part of it is Truma. You can do the same thing with Trumas Meiser. You can approximate the 10%, and you can just eyeball it and just say, that part over there, that's going to be the Trumas Meiser in that pile of grain. And similarly, there's an equation that just like the owner of the grain is allowed to designate Truma, so too the owner of the grain has the right, not the obligation, but has the right, if he wants to segregate Meiser and then take off 10% of that for Trumas Meiser as well. So the bottom line is that this is what the farmer, we assume the farmer does that in a case when he's designated to his son the amount. But when he hasn't designated to his son the amount, then we can't rest assured that he's taken Trumas Meiser and we have to take it ourselves.